It was a quiet night at the hospital, like so many others. The emergency lights flickered intermittently, sending out small beams of light that created dancing shadows in the hallways. The sound of nurses' footsteps, sometimes accompanied by the slight scraping of shoes, was the only thing breaking the comforting silence of that early morning. Their conversations were hushed, filled with the typical serenity of those who are accustomed to the calm of these hours. Everything seemed to follow its usual routine. The nurses checked patients' monitors, adjusted equipment, and exchanged words about their lives outside those walls. It was a moment of pause between the intense periods that hospital often experienced, but this tranquility was suddenly interrupted by an event that no one could have predicted. The automatic doors at the hospital's main entrance opened slowly, as if someone had activated them. Everyone stopped, looking in that direction. However, instead of a person entering, what appeared on the threshold was something completely unexpected. A dog. He was dirty, his fur covered in dry mud, his paws worn, and his gaze fixed. He wasn't just any dog. It was as if he were carrying a silent message, an urgency that his desperate eyes conveyed without needing words. The nurses exchanged confused looks, trying to make sense of the scene before them. The dog moved forward with firm but cautious steps, and everyone noticed that he was carrying something in his mouth. Wrapped in an old, worn blanket, there was a small bundle that appeared far too fragile. The hospital, so used to the predictability of human emergencies, stood still for a moment, unsure of what to do in the face of such an unlikely sight. That's when one of the nurses, perhaps driven by curiosity or a sense of duty, took a few steps toward the dog. Her heart was pounding as she tried to understand what was happening. When she finally saw what the dog was carrying, the world seemed to stop for an instant. "My God, it's a baby!" she exclaimed, unable to contain her emotion. Her words echoed through the empty lobby, snapping everyone back to reality. Immediately, the calm of the night gave way to a frantic rush. Doctors and nurses set aside the strangeness of the scene and sprang into action to save that tiny being. The dog, however, remained at the entrance, watching every movement with an intensity that seemed almost human, as if he understood that his mission was not yet complete. The hospital, once immersed in a nearly drowsy serenity, exploded into motion. Nurses and doctors ran to the scene, their voices intertwining in a mix of commands and questions. The baby was carefully taken from the dog, who, despite all the commotion, remained still, watching closely, as though he grasped the seriousness of the situation. The medical team wasted no time. The baby was rushed to the emergency room, where a small team was already waiting. Emily held her breath as she adjusted the equipment, her eyes fixed on the small being before her. The heart monitor showed irregular beats, and the child's body temperature was dangerously low. He needed immediate care. "We need to stabilize him now," said the lead doctor, his voice firm. Emily's hands and those of the other nurses moved with precision, attaching wires, connecting the baby to oxygen, and administering intravenous fluids. Every second felt like an eternity. The night's silence had been replaced by a race against time, and every professional in that room knew they could not fail. Meanwhile, in the hospital lobby, the dog was still waiting. He hadn't moved since the baby was taken from his mouth. His paws were visibly tired, and his eyes conveyed something no one could quite describe, like he knew his task wasn't done yet. Nurses passing through the lobby looked at him with admiration and curiosity. What kind of bond existed between that animal and the baby? How did he get there? There were many questions, but at that moment, only one thing mattered: saving that child's life. Everyone felt the impact of that moment. It wasn't just another medical emergency. It was a reminder of how fragile life is and how the unexpected can change everything. Emily knew that night would remain etched in her memory forever, not only for what was happening, but also for the profound sense of urgency and hope that a simple dog had brought to that hospital. While the medical team worked tirelessly to save the baby, the dog remained there, seated at the hospital entrance. He didn't move or make a sound, but his eyes said it all. There was something about him that held the attention of everyone who passed by. A nurse, hurrying back from the emergency room, stopped for a moment and looked at him. It was as if that dog wasn't just any animal but a guardian, someone who had come with a mission. No one understood where he had come from or how he knew the baby needed help, but one thing was certain: he was connected to the child in a special way. His eyes, fixed on the door that led to the baby, held a mix of concern and determination. He seemed to wait for news, as if he couldn't rest without knowing the baby was safe. A younger nurse, named Lisa, felt an urge to approach him. She walked slowly toward the dog and knelt down to look more closely. "You knew, didn't you?" she whispered, as if he could understand. The dog raised his head slightly and his eyes met hers. Lisa felt a chill. There was something in those eyes that felt almost human, a silent wisdom she couldn't explain. Even though the doctors and nurses were busy, they couldn't ignore the dog's presence. It was impossible not to notice the connection between him and the baby. It wasn't just the fact that he had brought the child to the hospital. There was something deeper, something everyone could sense but no one could put into words. He seemed to bear a greater responsibility, as if he knew the baby needed him to survive. Inside, the baby was still fighting for his life. His condition was starting to stabilize thanks to the quick, precise efforts of the medical team. But while the monitors showed signs of improvement, the image of the dog waiting outside never left Emily's mind. She thought about what that animal had done and how he seemed to grasp the gravity of the situation. Deep down, everyone knew that dog wasn't just a passive observer. He was the silent hero of that night. His unexpected act had given that baby a chance to live, something perhaps no one else would have done. It was as if he had been guided by something greater, an invisible force that drove him to act. As the first signs of hope appeared in the emergency room, Lisa once again petted the dog. "You're amazing," she said, her voice low and full of emotion. And for a brief moment, it seemed the dog understood. He lowered his head and closed his eyes, as if knowing his mission was almost complete. But he still waited, motionless, until he was sure the baby was out of danger. The entire hospital felt that the bond between the dog and the baby was something rare, something beyond human understanding, and that, in itself, was a miracle. The hospital waiting room was busier now. The doctor had just left the emergency room to update the nurses and the rest of the team on the baby's condition. He was stable but still in delicate shape. Meanwhile, outside, Max, named by one of the nurses, remained motionless, alert, as if still waiting for someone to call him to do something more. When the police arrived, the officers were greeted with looks of disbelief and admiration. The report that a dog had brought a baby to the hospital was so surreal that it seemed like a made-up story, but there was Max, living proof that it was all true. The officers watched him for a few minutes before deciding what to do. "We need to find out where he came from and, most importantly, who this baby's mother is," said Officer Thomas, adjusting his belt. One of the nurses suggested that maybe Max could show them the way. They all looked at one another, skeptical, but with no other options, they decided to try. With an improvised leash, Thomas approached Max, speaking in a calm voice. "Come on, boy, show us where you found him." To everyone's surprise, Max got up immediately. He didn't hesitate or look back. His steps were firm but tired. He knew exactly where he was going. The police followed the dog as the lights of the patrol cars lit the way through the city's quiet streets. Max guided them through alleys, across avenues, and finally stopped in front of an area that looked abandoned. The houses were old, some with broken doors and overgrown gardens. He headed straight for a small house with the door slightly ajar. His demeanor changed. He sat in front of the entrance and looked at the officers as if to say, "It's here." Thomas took a deep breath and signaled to his team. Flashlights in hand, they entered the house. The smell of mold and neglect was strong, and the place was steeped in oppressive darkness. With each step, the floor creaked under their boots. The furniture was covered in dust and piled carelessly, as if no one had lived there for a long time. But when they reached the back of the house, something caught their attention. In a dimly lit corner stood an old rusty crib. Over it lay a torn blanket, as if someone had improvised a bed for the baby. Next to it, an empty plate and a partially dried bowl of water, likely left for Max. The scene was both sad and meaningful. Someone had lived there with the baby and the dog, but they were no longer there. As the officers examined the place, one of them found a crumpled piece of paper on the floor, a letter. Some of the words were blurred, but still legible. The officer began reading it aloud. "I have no more strength. My world is falling apart. I trust only Max. I know he will do what I can no longer do. Please forgive me." The room fell silent. The weight of those words seemed to echo in the walls of that empty house. Max, sitting in the corner, watched everything with tired eyes. He had done exactly what the letter's author had hoped. He took care of the baby and brought him to a place where he would have a chance to survive. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, reflecting on the situation. "We need to find whoever wrote this. That person might still be nearby or may need help," he said, looking at his team. Their mission was now twofold: to protect the baby and find out what had driven someone to such a desperate act. While the police began to map out their next steps, Max lay down on the floor for the first time, letting out a heavy sigh, as though he knew he had fulfilled his mission. That night, he wasn't just a dog. The letter found in the abandoned house was the first clear clue for the police. It carried the weight of a story that no one fully understood yet, but that was beginning to take shape in their minds. Those words, written by a mother named Sarah, showed how much she had suffered. It was evident she loved her baby, but she was so overwhelmed and out of options that she did the unthinkable, entrusted her child's life to the dog who, it seemed, had been her only companion and support. With help from neighborhood residents and some investigation, the police managed to locate Sarah. She was wandering through a nearby park, disoriented, with sunken eyes and the appearance of someone who hadn't eaten or slept in days. When they found her, she was sitting on a bench, clutching a piece of cloth that looked like all she had left. The officers approached her carefully. "Sarah," called Officer Thomas, kneeling beside her. Her tear-filled eyes met his. She looked confused and fragile, as if trapped in a bad dream. "Your baby is alive. He's in the hospital receiving care," he said in the gentlest voice he could. Upon hearing that, Sarah started to cry. Silent tears streamed down her face as she muttered incoherent words. I had no choice," she mumbled, covering her face with her hands. "I had no one. He was so fragile, and I knew Max would do what I no longer could. He always took care of us." At the hospital, while Sarah received initial care, she began telling her story. It was a story of pain, loneliness, and a struggle no one should face alone. She explained how she'd been abandoned by the baby's father, and with no family or friends nearby, she became utterly isolated. Her resources ran out, and soon she didn't even have enough food for herself and the baby. "Max was always there," she said, her voice choked with gratitude. "He was more than a dog. He knew when I was about to give up and always did something to keep me going. When there was no food, he'd go out and bring back whatever he could. And when I realized I couldn't care for my child anymore, I trusted him. I knew he'd find a way." The doctors and nurses listening to her account were moved. Max wasn't just a pet. He was a protector, a loyal companion who had taken on the responsibility of saving that little family when everything seemed lost. As Sarah continued to recover, she asked to see Max and her baby. The reunion was emotional. When Sarah entered the observation room where the baby was, she sobbed at the sight of him connected to machines, but breathing and safe. And when Max was brought in to see her, his body tired but his eyes still alert, he immediately wagged his tail and rested his head in her hands as if to say, "I did what I was meant to do." Sarah knelt beside him, crying as she hugged him. "Thank you, Max," she whispered. "You saved us. I'll never forget what you did." At that moment, everyone in the room felt something special. It wasn't just the story of a desperate mother or a dog that seemed to understand more than anyone expected. It was a lesson about love, loyalty, and how, even in the darkest moments, hope can come from the most unexpected places. Sarah knew her path to rebuilding her life would be long, but with her baby in her arms and Max by her side, she felt she had a chance. The four-legged hero who saved her family was now part of a new story, a story of overcoming hardships, love, and a bond that no adversity could ever break. The days that followed were a mixture of relief and hope for Sarah. With the help of social workers, she and her baby, Noah, were moved to a safe shelter where they could finally rest. Little Noah, who had arrived at the hospital on the brink of death, was now stable, showing clear signs of recovery. Sarah held him in her arms more often than necessary, as if to make up for all the lost time. And Max? He, of course, stayed by their side. Even though he was exhausted, he seemed to understand that his family was safe now. His presence was more than comforting. It was a constant reminder that, even in the hardest times, he'd never abandoned them. The shelter where Sarah stayed offered more than just a roof and food. There were counseling services to help her start over, psychological support, childcare for Noah, and programs that would help Sarah find work in the future. Slowly, she began regaining the strength and courage she thought she had lost. It wasn't easy, but now she had a reason to go on. Her family was alive, and Max was a symbol of this new beginning. Max's story began to spread throughout the city. Nurses, police officers, and even neighbors who heard about what happened were moved. Social media was flooded with accounts of the hero dog who saved a baby, and soon people began offering support in various ways. Donations of clothes, food, and toys poured into the shelter. Some even offered financial assistance to ensure Sarah and Noah had a more stable future. One afternoon, while Sarah was sitting in the small room at the shelter, with Noah asleep beside her and Max lying near the door, a social worker came in with a smile on her face. "Sarah, we have good news. We've found temporary housing for you and Noah. It's a small place, but it's safe, and you'll have privacy to start your new life." Sarah felt tears well up in her eyes. After so long living in fear and uncertainty, she would finally have a place to call home. And of course, Max was going with them. "He's part of our family," Sarah said, hugging the dog. "Without him, we wouldn't be here." In their new home, life began to regain color. Sarah decorated Noah's small room with the donated toys. Max had his own special spot, though he rarely used it, preferring to stay close to Noah or Sarah. He seemed to know his mission was not entirely over yet. Now, he was the guardian of the new life they were building together. Over time, Sarah began going out more, meeting neighbors, and taking on small tasks recommended by the social services. Max's story continued to inspire everyone who heard it. It wasn't just about the heroic act of a dog, but about how loyalty and love can overcome any challenge. In a local newspaper interview, Sarah summed up her journey in one simple sentence. "When I had no more strength, Max carried everything for me. My fear, my pain, and even my baby. Now it's my turn to give back." Thus, Max, the four-legged hero, became a living legend in the city. He had not only saved a life, he had given Sarah and Noah a second chance to live, love, and start anew. Their story proved that even in the darkest moments, there is always hope, sometimes walking firmly on four paws. Sarah's restart was a delicate process filled with challenges, yet also filled with small daily miracles that reminded her of how blessed she was. The simple house where she now lived with Noah was a symbol of all she had overcome. Though modest, every corner of that home was filled with love and hope. For the first time in a long while, Sarah felt she had a space where she could grow and reinvent herself. Noah, who had been on the brink of death just months earlier, was now thriving. He had regained weight, his skin glowed with health, and his curious eyes were always exploring the world around him. Each sound he made, each attempt to crawl or stand up, reminded everyone of his strength and resilience. Sarah often watched him as he slept, silent tears running down her face. These tears weren't sad. They were tears of profound gratitude. Noah was alive, he was well, and that was all that mattered. And of course Max was always nearby. The dog that had saved their lives was more than a pet. He was a companion, a guardian, a symbol of everything that love and loyalty could achieve. He followed Noah everywhere, like a silent shadow. When Noah started crawling around the small yard, Max trotted along beside him, alert to every movement. When Noah, with his small wobbly hands, began trying to stand, Max stayed put, like a pillar of support for the little one. The bond between Noah and Max was something everyone who visited noticed immediately. They were inseparable, as if they shared a special understanding, a connection forged in the darkest moments. Sarah watched this bond grow and felt even more grateful. Max was not just the dog who brought Noah to the hospital that night. He was now an essential part of their lives, an emotional anchor for both of them. But Sarah's new start wasn't just about building a home for Noah. She also needed to rebuild herself. Community support was crucial. Social workers stayed by her side, offering guidance, resources, and constant encouragement.
A local job reintegration program gave Sarah the chance to start working at a nearby bakery. It wasn't her dream job, but it was the first step toward independence. There, she not only learned how to make bread and pastries, but also to regain her self-confidence. The generosity of those around her was astounding. Many who heard her story, and especially Max's, rallied to help. Donations of clothes, food, and furniture arrived on her doorstep. A neighbor brought an almost new stroller. Another arrived with a bed for Noah. Sarah, who once believed she was completely alone, began to realize the power of community support. She felt she wasn't just rebuilding her life, but becoming part of something bigger. Max, too, didn't go unnoticed. The story of the hero dog spread through the city, and soon people began stopping Sarah in the street to ask about him. Children wanted to pet him, and adults wanted to take pictures. Max has always remained calm, almost oblivious to all the attention. For him, his mission wasn't to be famous. His mission was to stay by Sarah and Noah, protecting and caring for them. Meanwhile, Noah continued to grow, surrounded by love. His first laugh came on a sunny morning when Max, ever by his side, wagged his tail and licked his awkward little feet. The laughter echoed through the house, filling Sarah's heart with a happiness she hadn't felt in a long time. And when Noah took his first steps, they were in Max's direction, clutching the dog's fur for balance. Max, as always, remained steady, offering the support Noah needed. Sarah, on her part, also began finding new reasons to smile. Working in the bakery brought not only financial stability, but also a sense of purpose. She began making friends among her co-workers and even shared her story with others, inspiring people going through tough times. "If Max could save my life and my son's, then I can help others too," she said, her eyes shining. The entire town seemed moved by Sarah and Max's story. The dog's love and loyalty became a local symbol. Some people even began to see Max as a sort of local hero, but for Sarah, he was much more than that. He was the friend who never left her side, the protector of her son, and the reason they were still together. Days that once seemed endless and filled with suffering were now filled with life and movement. Sarah still had many challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long while, she wasn't afraid. She felt strong. Each morning was a new chance to start over, and each night, as Noah slept and Max rested by his bed, she silently gave thanks for everything she had. Deep down, Sarah knew her journey was just beginning. But now, with Noah growing strong and Max by her side, she had something that once seemed impossible: hope. And with that, every little step toward the future was a victory. The restart wasn't easy, but it was beautiful because it was real, built on love, resilience, and the unwavering loyalty of a four-legged hero. As time went by, Max's story continued to resonate throughout the city. It wasn't just the extraordinary act of a dog who had saved a baby. It was something much bigger. Max represented courage, unconditional love, and the incredible power that bonds of trust can have to transform lives. People who heard about him didn't just see an animal. They saw an example of how, even in the toughest times, love can overcome any obstacle. Sarah often reflected on what she had gone through. There were nights when, after Noah fell asleep quietly in his little bed and Max lay on the floor nearby, she would sit in silence in the living room, looking out the window. In those moments of calm, her mind would return to those dark days, when she believed all was lost. She remembered how lonely and abandoned she felt, without the strength to go on. But even in that darkness, Max was there, never leaving her side. He watched her with his alert gaze, always offering silent comfort. And when the most desperate hour arrived, when she saw no way out, he did not hesitate. Max took on the responsibility of saving the baby she could no longer protect. For Sarah, it wasn't merely heroism. It was pure love, the kind of love that expects nothing in return. Now, when she looked at Noah playing in the yard or taking his first steps alongside Max, she felt a gratitude she couldn't put into words. Max was not just the dog who saved her child. He was the thread that held her family together when everything else seemed to fall apart. He was living proof that, even in the most desperate situations, there is still hope. Max's story began to inspire others in ways Sarah never imagined. Local schools used it to teach about empathy and loyalty. A pet store launched a campaign to encourage the adoption of stray dogs, using Max as an example of just how a dog can transform a life. Even people who didn't know Sarah personally were touched by what they heard about her and Max. For her part, Sarah felt a responsibility to share her journey, not because she sought attention, but because she knew her story could give strength to other people facing difficulties. At community gatherings and local events, she spoke of the moments when she thought she couldn't go on, and how Max had been her light. "He's not just my hero. He's why I'm here today, holding my son, rebuilding my life," she would say, moved to tears. Max, as always, remained by her side, calm and serene. He seemed oblivious to the admiration he received, but Sarah knew that in his heart he understood. He always had. Over time, Sarah's small house became more than just a home. It became a symbol of starting over. The visits from community members, Noah's playtime with Max in the yard, and the laughter that filled the space all testified to how much life can change. Sarah knew she would still face trials, but she also knew she carried a strength she once didn't recognize in herself. In those reflective moments, she would look at Max and wonder how something so simple, the love and loyalty of a dog, could have changed so much. He wasn't just a hero. He was the personification of faith, persistence, and never giving up, even when everything seems impossible. Thus, Max's legacy continued to grow. He was not only remembered as the dog who saved a baby, he became an inspiration, proof that love, even when it comes from the most unexpected places, can be powerful enough to change destinies. For Sarah, Noah, and everyone who knew their story, Max wasn't just an animal. He was family, and their tale of love and hope would never be forgotten. And so, the story of Max, Sarah, and Noah teaches us that love and loyalty can overcome even the hardest moments. It's a lesson in courage, resilience, and hope that touches our hearts and reminds us to value the bonds that unite us, no matter where they come from. Now we want to hear from you. What did you think of this moving story? Leave a comment below with your opinion or share if you've experienced something similar. Don't forget to like this video if it inspired you and to subscribe to the channel to follow more stories like this. Your participation is very important to us. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.